Tom Gulley here on the Tom Gulley Show. Tonight, let me tell you about the Tenerife air disaster, the deadliest aviation disaster in history. We'll get to that in just a little while, right after our cold open here. We do that, of course, as usual. I'll just explain it. It's for our audio podcast people who we love. We love the audio podcast people. The show started off as an audio podcast, these many, many years ago. And we do this because when people listen to an audio podcast, they would be disconcerted by hearing the music that I typically play that allows people to slowly enter our YouTube chat room. That's what gives us the magic of the, interactivity that we have here on the program. Yeah. So that's why we do it. And we also do it so, even before I play these songs, which you can fast forward through if you're listening to us in audio form, I get to say Happy New Year. Welcome 2026. Hopefully it is, whether you had a great 2025 or a horrible 2025, 2026 offers you a better experience. I know I didn't have to say that. That's what makes it such a beautiful gesture on my part. And I know you might get tired of hearing the explanation, and well, it's just so that when you in audio podcast form come here, you don't just hear a bunch of music and say, hey, I didn't come here for music. Why are you dragging me into your private nightmare? This is why. So, without further ado, I'll play a couple songs, and then we'll get into tonight's topic. And right now, Indiana is beating the tar out of Alabama. For those of you who follow sports. Anyway, we'll be back in just a second.
Early in the morning, daylight coming through. Coffee on the console, red lights next to blue. Got a voice that settles in, easy, calm and true. The man from Gulley next to you. He's got stories in the static, time in his hands, turning ordinary moments into things you understand. You know I'm happy to be here. Tom is thinking again. Got the chat leaning closer to hear where he's been. You know I'm happy to be here. Feel the calming sense.
and some pills for the man with the Letterman star. And if Tom came to your country, would you keep him for a while? Surrounding yourself in his familiar smile. And when he comes around, the stadiums fill up fully. They shout, "Is that him, Mr. Gulley? Is that Tom? It's Tom Gulley." They yell, "Is that him, Mr. Gulley? Is that Tom? It's Tom Gulley." They say, "Is that him, Mr. Gulley? Is that Tom? It's Tom Gulley."
Hey everybody, what's going on? What's hot? What's hip? What's happening? What is shaking? Happy New Year, happy 2026. Tonight, let me tell you about the Tenerife air disaster, the deadliest aviation disaster in history. There is an amazing YouTube channel that I highly recommend. It's called Pilot Debrief, and it's hosted by a former military jet fighter pilot named Hoover. And he refers to the elements that cause an aviation disaster as the holes lining up in a Swiss cheese. You know, they're not just one thing. There's got to be a conflagration of things that cause an aviation disaster. And when I tell you the details of this one, you will see that random happenstance, a number of things contributed to what was just a catastrophic loss of life. We'll get to all that in just a minute. Before we do, please like, share, subscribe, retweet, notification bell, all the absolutely free things you can do. They only cost you a click to help us with the algorithm, the almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing algorithm. Plus, we do have super chats. We do have memberships. We have gifted memberships. We have the PayPal, where you give the most, I get the most. Google don't get nothing. It's all in our YouTube description for every single episode. You can go to the TomGulleyShow.com. There's podcasts there, along with our merchandise store. In addition to the fact, we're on Podbean. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify. We're on a lot of things. I don't even know all of them because it's an RSS feed and people just take it and they do with it. It's just wherever fine podcasts are given away for free. You'll find us there. Let's go to our chat room very, very quickly. We've got Terry Nee here. He asks a question, a very leading question that I'm about to answer in just minutes. Seconds, actually. And I say, yes, you're right about the thing that you want to know about that I'm going to be talking about for the next hour. And I then say, thanks for the spoiler. Don't you have any patience? I thought old people were patient, which was a hilarious joke, given that we're almost identically aged. And I got no response. So maybe scared off yet another listener. Chef is here. He is on the couch. Hello, Chef. And let's get into it, shall we? The Tenerife airport disaster occurred on the 27th of March, 1977, and with a total of 583 fatalities, it is the deadliest accident in aviation history. Now, this particular disaster involves not one, but two 747 airliners. And it did occur on the island of Tenerife, which is one of the Canary Islands owned by Spain. And Tenerife was an unscheduled stop for both of these flights. Both flights were heading to another airport in the Canary Islands, a much bigger airport actually, called Gran Canaria Airport, serving Las Palmas on the nearby island of Gran Canaria. And the first aircraft, I should say, was KLM Flight 4805. Now, this particular flight was the Royal Dutch Airlines, but it was a charter flight. It wasn't a regularly scheduled passenger airline flight that anyone could take. It was chartered. It was rented out, so to speak, for folks to use. And there is that particular aircraft right there. The Holland International Group had chartered this and had arrived from Amsterdam Airport in the Netherlands. The cockpit crew, very experienced, extremely experienced. Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten was 50 years of age. First Officer Klaus Mers, 42 years of age. Flight Engineer Willem Schroeder, 48 years of age. And at the time of this accident, the captain, who was KLM's chief flight instructor, this particular airline's chief flight instructor, had 11,700 flight hours, and 1,500 of those were on the 747. Mers had 9,200 flight hours. 95 of those hours were on the 747. And Schroeder had 17,000 flight hours. 543 of those hours were on the 747. As I mentioned, this was a Boeing 747, and the jet was carrying 14 crew members and 235 passengers, including 52 children. Most of the KLM passengers, and this makes perfect sense given the fact that it was a Dutch Airlines, most of them were Dutch. But also on board were 4 Germans, 2 Austrians, and 2 Americans. After the aircraft landed at Tenerife, the passengers actually got off the plane and were transported to the airport terminal. Now, why did this plane have to land at Tenerife? Why didn't it just go to Gran Canaria? The reason for that is one of these inexplicable things that happened to cause this disaster. Gran Canaria Airport was a much larger airport. Tenerife, much, much smaller. A terrorist group, I won't get into which one, I don't want to glorify them, they set off a bomb in the airport at Gran Canaria. And in an abundance of caution, they diverted all flights to neighboring airports, like Tenerife. So when the aircraft landed at Tenerife, it was clear that the aircraft would be there a while. The passengers were actually transported to the terminal. They got off the plane. One of the inbound passengers, Robina van Lanschot, actually lived on the island of Tenerife with their boyfriend, and she chose not to reboard, leaving just 234 passengers on board. Perhaps she had plans to land in Gran Canaria and find other transportation to Tenerife, but she figures, hey, I'm where I live. There's no reason for me to get back on this plane. The other flight was Pan Am Flight 1736, and this flight was also a charter flight. Royal Cruise Line had chartered the flight. It originated in Los Angeles International Airport with an intermediate stop at New York City's John F. Kennedy International Airport. Of the 380 passengers, mostly of retirement age, but including 2 children, 14 had gotten on the plane in New York, and the crew was also changed in New York. All but 5 passengers on board the aircraft were Americans, and all of the non-American passengers were Canadian nationals. These people were on their way to board the cruise ship Golden Odyssey for a 14-day trip across the Mediterranean. The new crew that started in New York consisted of Captain Victor Grubbs, who was 56, First Officer Robert Bragg, 39, and Flight Engineer George Warnes, 46, along with 13 flight attendants. At the time of the accident, the captain had 21,000 hours of flight time, of which 564 hours were on the 747. Bragg had 10,800 flight hours, and he had 2,796 hours on the 747. Flight Engineer Warnes had 15,000 flight hours, of which 559 hours were on the 747. You can get flight hours on a number of different aircraft, so your total flight hours show how experienced you are as a pilot. The number of flight hours you have on a particular aircraft show how experienced you are on that particular model and style of plane. Now, this Pan Am plane, known as Clipper Victor, was a historically notable plane. It was the first Boeing 747 to operate a commercial airline flight when it flew from JFK in New York to London Heathrow in January of 1970. And in its first year of service in August of 1970, it also became the first 747 to be hijacked between JFK and Luis Muñoz Marin Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It was diverted to Jose Marti International Airport in Havana, Cuba. Now, both flights had been absolutely routine until they approached the Canary Islands. At about 1:15, a bomb planted by a separatist group exploded, as I mentioned, in the terminal of Gran Canaria Airport, injuring 8 people. Now, due to the threat of a second bomb, the civil aviation authorities closed the airport temporarily after the first explosion, and all incoming flights bound for Gran Canaria were diverted to Los Rodeos Airport, which was the name of the airport in Tenerife, including the 2 aircraft that we're going to be talking about today. The Pan Am crew indicated, and this is another of those inexplicable if-onlys that could have prevented this loss of life. The Pan Am crew indicated they would prefer to circle in a holding pattern until landing clearance was given. They had enough fuel to stay in the air for 2 more hours very safely, but they were ordered to divert to Los Rodeos in Tenerife. Now, Los Rodeos was a regional airport that could not easily accommodate all of the traffic that was diverted from Gran Canaria, the bigger airport. It included 5 very large airliners. The airport only had 1 runway and 1 major taxiway running parallel to it, with 4 short taxiways that would connect the taxiways to the runway. While waiting for Gran Canaria to reopen, the diverted planes took up so much space that they had to just park on that long taxiway, making it unavailable for the purpose of taxiing. It was just jammed up with parking. Instead, departing aircraft needed to taxi along the runway to position themselves for a takeoff, a procedure known as a back taxi or a backtrack. So what they had to do was go to whatever point on the runway they were, go all the way to the end and turn around and then take off. Rather than, you've been on a plane, hopefully, just taxiing and then you get at the end of the runway and off you go. No, they had to go all the way to the end of the runway and come back. The authorities reopened Gran Canaria Airport once the bomb threat had been contained. The Pan Am airplane was ready to depart from Tenerife. But access to the runway, the ability to get to the runway, was obstructed by the KLM plane and a refueling vehicle. The KLM captain had decided to fully refuel at Los Rodeos instead of Las Palmas, apparently to save time. So the Pan Am aircraft is now unable to get around the refueling Dutch airplane in order to reach the runway for takeoff. There was only about 12 feet of clearance between the two planes had they tried to do that. This refueling took 35 minutes. So the passengers on the Pan Am plane are being made to wait by the Dutch plane, and the captain of the Pan Am plane was not happy about this. The refueling took about 35 minutes, after which the passengers, remember, who had departed the Dutch aircraft and gone to the airport terminal. Refueling takes place. All the passengers are brought back onto the aircraft, which also took some time. The search for a missing Dutch family of 4 who had not returned to the Dutch plane delayed the flight even further. And as I mentioned, Robina van Landschot, a tour guide, didn't even reboard because she lived on Tenerife and thought it was very impractical to fly back to the other airport only to return again. She therefore was not on the plane when the accident happened, and thus was the only survivor of those who flew from Amsterdam to Tenerife on Flight 4805. Now, this is when things start to get kind of messy. And I should point out that, the captain of the Dutch plane, the KLM plane, was kind of a rock star in the KLM world. Okay? He was featured prominently. That's him right there in this ad from the people who made punctuality possible. And it was positioned as sort of a luxurious European Airlines, that you would fly. The theme line is the reliable airline of those surprising Dutch. But there he is. That's him right there. Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten. Okay. And by the way, I'll mention it again. The captain of the Pan Am plane was really not happy at all. I mean, not at all with this other captain for the refueling and everything else and blocking him from taking off, basically. It was not considered proper etiquette. Okay. By the way, here is an actual photo of both planes. Okay. On the ground at Tenerife before this disaster occurred. The Clipper Victor is the one that you can see the whole plane, and the one that's in the foreground, sort of, is the KLM flight. But that's the two of them on the day of the accident. So the tower instructs the Dutch plane to taxi down the entire length of the runway and then make a 180-degree turn to get into takeoff position. As I mentioned, the taxiway shut down, closed. You can't use it to taxi. So they had to use the runway. So the tower says, look, go to the end of the runway, make a 180-degree turn, and get into takeoff position. Now, while the KLM, the Dutch plane, was back taxiing on the runway, the controller asked the flight crew to report when it was ready to copy the air traffic control clearance. And because the flight crew was performing the checklist, copying the clearance was postponed until the aircraft was in takeoff position. Now, copying the clearance, basically agreeing that you have clearance is a big deal. Clearance means you can take off. You are cleared for takeoff. Now, there's some other reasons I'm going to bring up, some more parts of what Hoover from Pilot Debrief might call another hole in the Swiss cheese. The air traffic controllers might not have even had good grounds to give that clearance, and we'll get to that in just a second. Now, shortly after this happened, the Pan Am was instructed to follow the KLM plane down the same runway and exit the runway by taking the third of those 4 short little taxiways to use the big taxiway. Basically, go around all the other parked planes on the actual taxiway and cut across toward the end where there's room, and then use the parallel taxiway. Well, initially the crew was unclear as to whether the controller had told them to take the first exit or the third exit. They asked for clarification, and the controller responded very emphatically by replying, "The third one, sir. 1, 2, 3, third one." So the crew began taxiing and proceeded to identify the unmarked taxiways using an airport diagram as they reached them. And they had to do it this way because these taxiways did not have numbers on them. I'm sure you've been on a plane before, looked out the window while you're on the ground. Sometimes when you land at an airport, or even when you take off, you pass all of these little signs, 2L, 4G, 14R. Yeah, those did not exist at this airport. So the crew identified the first taxiways, but their discussion in the cockpit indicated that they had not sighted the third one, which they had been instructed to use. There were no markings, no signs to identify them, as I mentioned, and they were in conditions of poor visibility, which I'll get to in a second. It's another of these elements that add up to this tragedy. The Pan Am crew appeared to remain unsure of their position on the runway until what happened, which occurred near the intersection with the last side taxiway to cut across to this parallel taxiway off of the runway. Now, the angle of these taxiways, even that is a point of contention. The angle of the third taxiway would have required the Pan Am plane to perform a 148-degree turn, which is almost a 180-degree turn, which would lead back toward the still crowded taxiway. And then, after they made that turn, at the end of that short taxiway, they would have had to make another 148-degree turn to continue taxiing toward the start of the runway. Imagine a sort of a letter Z they would have had to have made. A study carried out by the Airline Pilots Association after this accident concluded making the second 148-degree turn at the end of the taxiway would have been a practical impossibility. Yeah. Now let's get to those weather conditions. Oh, mama. Los Rodeos Airport is just 2,000 feet above sea level. And it gives rise to weather conditions that differ from those at many other airports. Clouds at 2,000 feet above ground level on the coast are at ground level at Los Rodeos. So 2,000 feet up, there's clouds. If you're at sea level on the coast, that's 2,000 feet up there. Up there. See, my finger's pointing for those of you listening to our audio podcast. But if you're at 2,000 feet, you're in those clouds. Drifting clouds of different densities cause wildly different visibilities, from completely unhindered at one moment to below the legal minimum the next moment. And this accident took place in a high-density cloud. Not just a cloud, a high-density cloud. The Pan Am crew found themselves in poor and rapidly deteriorating visibility almost the second they hit the runway. According to the Airline Pilots Association report, as the Pan Am aircraft taxied the runway, the visibility was about 1,600 feet, which is not great, but it's 1,600 feet. Shortly after they turned onto the runway, it decreased to less than 330 feet. Their visibility was only about that of a football field. Meanwhile, the KLM plane, the Dutch plane, was still in good visibility, but with clouds blowing down the runway toward them. They completed that 180-degree turn that they were supposed to do in pretty clear weather and lined up on the runway. The next cloud was 3,000 feet down the runway and moving toward the aircraft at about 14 miles an hour. And that's when the communication problems started. Ooh, mama. Let's go to our chat room real quickly. Oh, Crappy at Life. Yes, that's a screen name, ladies and gentlemen. Happy New Year to you, sir. Says, happy to be here. Happy to see you, sir. Immediately after lining up for this takeoff, the KLM captain advanced the throttles, and the aircraft started to move forward. His co-pilot advised him that the air traffic control clearance had not yet been given. And Veldhuizen van Zanten, the captain, responded, "No, I know that. Go ahead, ask." So co-pilot radios the tower that they were ready for takeoff and waiting for our clearance. Air traffic control radioed the aircraft, addressing them by the wrong call sign, by the way. But the KLM still interpreted that transmission as theirs, providing instructions that specified the route the aircraft was to follow after takeoff. I'll get to that sort of in a second, but did not clear them for takeoff. They kind of said, yeah, you're going to bank to the right at this vector and go to this other one. And they gave them instructions that were all clearly after takeoff, and they still had not been given clearance. To add to the confusion, the controller had used the word takeoff in his clearance instructions, potentially convincing Veldhuizen van Zanten, the captain, that a takeoff clearance had been issued. So co-pilot reads the flight clearance back to the controller, completing the read back with the statement, "We are now at takeoff." Veldhuizen van Zanten interrupted the first officer's readback with the comment, "We're going." In other words, he's basically going, "Hey, I heard him. We're going. We're taking off." The controller, who could not see the runway due to the fog and did not have any ground radar to use at the airport, initially responded with, "Okay." Now, okay is non-standard language in airline communications. Okay, it's a word that means two things. It means yes. Hey, can I come over tomorrow? Okay, it means yes. And it also means, hey, how are your instruments looking? They're looking okay. In other words, they're fine, they're good. So his response of okay, when the first officer said, "We're now at takeoff," he said, "Okay." That could have just meant, "I understand that." But it was likely due to a misinterpretation that, oh, he said, "Okay, we get to take off." But then the controller immediately added, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you," indicating he had not intended the instruction to be interpreted as a takeoff clearance. These guys are getting ready to take off. And I mean, not just getting ready. They're this far from going to full takeoff, and they haven't gotten a clearance yet. A simultaneous radio call from the Pan Am crew caused mutual interference on the radio frequency. I bet you've had a walkie-talkie when you were a kid, and if two people try to talk at once, it creates that interference. Kind of the same thing here. So that mutual interference that was audible in the KLM cockpit is a 3-second long shrill sound, also known as a heterodyne if you're an audio freak like me. This caused the KLM crew to miss the crucial latter portion of the tower's response. Okay? Another one of these, if only. If only that hadn't happened. By the way, Ryan Paradisus says, "Pot Awful 1, Happy New Year." Happy New Year to you too, Ryan. Randy, also known as Chef, says, "I'm sorry, Tom, I have to go. Happy New Year's and best to you in 2026. Everybody say Happy New Year's, Gracie. Happy New Year's, Gracie. And good night, Gracie." So the KLM crew misses this crucial ending part of the tower's response, which is like, "I will call you, I'll let you know when you can take off." The Pan Am crew's transmission was, "We're still taxiing down the runway." And that message was also blocked by the interference and not heard by the Dutch aircraft. Either one of those two messages, either one of them, if they'd been heard in the KLM aircraft, would have alerted the crew to the situation and given them time to abort their takeoff attempt. Due to the fog, neither crew was able to see the other plane on the runway ahead of them. In addition, neither of the aircraft could be seen from the control tower because, as I mentioned, there's no ground radar. After the KLM plane had started its takeoff roll, the tower instructed Pan Am to report the runway clear. Pan Am crew replied, "Okay, we will report when we're clear." In other words, we're not off of the runway yet. Upon hearing this, the KLM flight engineer expressed his concern about the Pan Am not being clear of the runway by asking the pilots in his own cockpit, saying, "Is he not clear, the Pan American?" And the captain of the KLM aircraft, Veldhuizen van Zanten, emphatically replied, "Oh, yes," and continued the takeoff. According to the cockpit voice recorder, the Pan Am captain said, "There he is," when he spotted the KLM's landing lights through the fog just as his plane approached their plane. When it became clear that the KLM aircraft was approaching at takeoff speed, Captain Grubbs explained, "GD, that SOB is coming," while First Officer Robert Bragg yelled, "Get off, get off, get off," meaning get off the runway. Grubbs applied full power to the throttles and made a sharp left turn toward the grass in an attempt to avoid the impending collision. By the time the KLM pilots saw the Pan Am aircraft, they had already exceeded their V speed. And V speed is airspeeds that are important or useful to the operation of the aircraft. Basically, they'd already reached the speed they were supposed to be at for takeoff at that point on the runway. And they were moving too fast to stop, far too fast to stop. In desperation, pilots prematurely rotated the aircraft nose upward, rotate meaning pull back on the stick, and attempted to clear the Pan Am by lifting off, causing a 72-foot tail strike. The KLM was within 330 feet of the Pan Am and moving approximately 160 miles an hour. So they've already tilted their plane, and their tail has hit the runway, and it's 72 foot, because they haven't lifted off yet. They're at that speed, but they haven't, gotten airborne. The KLM 7047's nose gear, landing gear on the nose, cleared the Pan Am, but its left side engines, lower fuselage, and main landing gear, the rear landing gear, struck the upper right side of the Pan Am's fuselage, ripping apart the middle of the Pan Am jet almost directly above the wing. The KLM 747's right side engines crashed through the Pan Am's upper deck, immediately aft of the cockpit, right behind the cockpit, instantly killing all of the passengers seated there. The KLM remained briefly airborne, but the impact had sheared off the number one engine, which was on the outer left, and, let me get there. Sheared off the number one engine, caused significant amounts of shredded materials to be ingested by the number two engine on the inner left and damaged the wings. The plane immediately went into a stall, rolled sharply, and hit the ground about 500 feet past the collision, sliding down the runway a further 1,000 feet. And upon impact with the runway, keep in mind these two planes were about to take off. The KLM had just been refueled. It's loaded with fuel. The Pan Am had at least 2 hours worth of fuel on it when they landed. Upon impact with the runway, the full load of fuel, which had caused the earlier delay, ignited immediately into a fireball that could not be subdued for several hours. One of the 61 survivors, and yes, there were survivors on the Pan Am flight, said that sitting in the nose of the plane probably saved his life. We all settled back, and the next thing, an explosion took place, and the whole port side, the left side of the plane, was just torn wide open. As I mentioned, Veldhuizen van Zanten was KLM's chief of flight training and one of their most senior pilots. About 2 months before the accident, he had conducted the Boeing 747 qualification check for the first officer on that flight. His photograph, as I showed you, was used for publicity materials like magazine ads, including the in-flight magazine on board the fated plane that day. KLM had suggested initially that Veldhuizen van Zanten should help with the investigation because they were unaware that he had lost his life in the accident. Both aircraft were obviously destroyed in the collision. All 248 passengers and crew aboard the KLM plane died, as did 326 passengers and 9 of the 16 crew aboard the Pan Am plane, primarily due to fire and explosions resulting from the fuel spilled and ignited in the impact. The other 61 passengers and crew aboard the Pan Am aircraft survived. There were initially 70 survivors, but 9 passengers later died of their injuries. Among the survivors were the captain, first officer, flight engineer, and 4 flight attendants. Most of the survivors on the Pan Am plane walked out onto the intact left wing, the side away from the collision, through holes in the fuselage and the structure. By the way, like, share, subscribe, retweet, notification bell. Man, we'd appreciate it. I'm trying to make this little show grow. You can do it with just a click. It really helps. We have super chats. We have memberships. We have the PayPal. You give the most. I get the most. Google don't get nothing. It's all in the description of our YouTube shows. Oh, and our audio podcast is available all over the place. You might trip on it on the way to the bathroom late at night. I don't know. Anyway, the Pan Am's engines were still running for a few minutes. They were actually still running after the accident, despite the first officer's attempts to turn them off. The roof of the cockpit, where the engine switchers are located, had been destroyed in the collision, and all control lines were severed. So there was no means, there was no way for the flight crew to control the aircraft systems, including engine fire extinguishers. Survivors waited for rescue, but it didn't come right away, as the firefighters were initially unaware that there were 2 aircraft involved, and they concentrated on the KLM wreckage hundreds of meters away in thick fog and smoke. Eventually, most of the survivors from the Pan Am flight on the wing dropped down to the ground below. The Pan Am fatalities included 53 passengers from Orange County, California, mostly retirees taking that package tour. Yes. Obviously, Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, chief and flight instructor for KLM, captain of the flight, passed away. A.P. Hammond, the former city manager of San Jose, California, was on the Pan Am flight and lost his life. Another person on the Pan Am flight that lost their life was Eve Meyer, pinup model, film actress, and producer who was the second wife of film director Russ Meyer. She happened to be on the plane as well. The following day, the Canary Islands Independence Movement, that terrorist group responsible for the bombing at the Gran Canaria airport that started the chain of events leading to the disaster, denied all responsibility for the accident, which is ludicrous to me, because had they not done what they did, none of this would have happened. None of it. Los Rodeos Airport was closed to all fixed-wing traffic for 2 days. Investigations took place. About 70 personnel were involved, including representatives from the United States, the Netherlands, and the airline companies. The facts showed there had been misinterpretations and false assumptions before the accident. Analysis of the cockpit voice recorder transcript showed that the KLM captain thought he had been cleared for takeoff, while the Tenerife control tower believed that the KLM was stationary, awaiting for clearance. KLM at first made some denials, but they eventually admitted to culpability in this. The captain, Veldhuizen van Zanten, he did attempt to take off without clearance. Investigators suggested the reason for this was a desire to leave as soon as possible in order to comply with KLM's duty time regulations put in place earlier that year, and because he thought the weather would deteriorate further. Other factors, major factors that were found to contribute to this accident, were heavy and sudden fog, providing limited visibility, and the control tower and the crews of both planes were unable to see one another. Also, interference from simultaneous radio transmissions made hearing messages difficult. Other factors considered to be contributing but not critical were the use of ambiguous non-standard phrases by the KLM first officer, "We're at takeoff," and the Tenerife control tower, "Okay." The Pan Am aircraft did not leave the runway at the third exit as instructed, and the airport was forced to accommodate a great number of large aircraft rerouted by the terrorist incident. Dutch authorities were reluctant to accept the Spanish report blaming the KLM captain, but eventually they did, and compensated all of the people involved. They didn't want to blame Veldhuizen Van Zanten and his crew, but they accepted responsibility and they paid the victim's family compensation ranging between $58,000 and $600,000. That's $301,000 to $3.1 million today. The sum of settlements for property and damages was $110 million, which would be $571 million today. An average of $189,000 or about $1 million today per victim. Due to limitations, incidentally, imposed by European compensation conventions in effect at the time. It was one of the first accident investigations to include a study into the contribution of human factors. Okay? Veldhuizen Van Zanten, for example, had not flown on regular routes for 12 weeks prior to the accident. I mentioned those legally allowable on-duty hours. Those on-duty hours were likely the reason Captain Veldhuizen Van Zanten chose to refuel, so that he wouldn't have to stop and do that at the larger airport. There was a hesitation on the part of the flight engineer and the first officer to challenge Veldhuizen Van Zanten. Not just because of seniority, but because he was one of the most respected and visible pilots working for the airline. The extra fuel taken on by the KLM plane added several factors. Takeoff was delayed an extra 35 minutes. That's another piece of the Swiss cheese, another one of the if-onlys. That allowed time for the fog to settle in. More than 45 tons of additional weight was added to the aircraft, increasing the takeoff distance and making it more difficult for them to clear the Pan Am when they tried to get over it. And, of course, the increased severity of the fire caused by the additional fuel, ultimately killing everyone on board. As you might imagine, the funeral was large. This funeral took place at the Amsterdam Airport Schiphol in April of 1977. As a consequence of this accident, however, sweeping changes were made to international airline regulations and to aircraft. Aviation authorities around the world introduced requirements for standard phrases and a greater emphasis on English as the common working language in the aviation industry. And some people might say, well, why would you do that? Because we build all of the planes, except the Russian ones. They're U.S. built. Air traffic instruction must not be acknowledged solely with a colloquial phrase such as okay or even Roger, but with a readback of the key parts of the instruction to show mutual understanding. So, okay, TG 100, you are cleared for takeoff. TG 100, cleared for takeoff. You repeat the instruction. The word takeoff is now only spoken when the actual takeoff clearance is given or when canceling that same clearance. Until that point, aircrew and controllers should use the word departure, ready for departure, preparing for departure. Takeoff only gets used when you are taking off. Cockpit procedures were also changed after the incident. The hierarchy between crew members was somewhat played down, and a greater emphasis was placed on the team decision-making by mutual agreement. 1978, a second airport was opened on the island of Tenerife, the new Tenerife South Airport, which now serves the majority of international tourist flights. Los Rodeos was renamed Tenerife North Airport and was then used only for domestic and inter-island flights until 2002, until a new terminal was opened in 2002 and the airport began to receive international traffic once again. The Spanish government installed a ground radar system also at Tenerife North Airport following the accident. There are a number of memorials to this particular incident. There's one in Amsterdam at Westgard Cemetery. There's also a memorial at the Westminster Memorial Park and Mortuary in Westminster, California. In 1977, a cross in Rancho Bernardo, San Diego, was dedicated to 19 area residents who perished in the disaster. In 2007, the 30th anniversary marked the first time that Dutch and American next of kin and aid helpers from Tenerife joined an international commemoration service held at the Auditorio de Tenerife in Santa Cruz. The International Tenerife Memorial, 27 March 77, was inaugurated at the Mesa Mota on the 27th of March 2007. There are a plethora, I mean a plethora of documentaries about this. Episode 1 of Survival in the Sky called Blaming the Pilot. Episode 12 of Seconds from Disaster called Collision on the Runway. Episode 625 of PBS's Nova, The Deadliest Plane Crash, 2006. The PBS special Surviving Disaster, How the Brain Works Under Extreme Duress, which was based on Amanda Ripley's book, The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. An episode of Destroyed in Seconds, episode 133 of the Canadian TV series Mayday, Disaster at Tenerife, as well as the earlier in-depth 90-minute special, Crash of the Century. Footage of the wreckage appears in the disaster documentary Days of Fury. Episode 5 of the Nebula series, Underexposure. Series 5, episodes 1 and 2 of Cautionary Tales podcast, hosted by Tim Harford. So the greatest aviation disaster in history happened when one plane hadn't left the ground and another plane did so only briefly. The Tenerife Airport disaster. That's all I got to tell you about this incident. And with that, let's go to our intrepid chat room. Tim Jenkinson says Pan Am seemed to specialize in crashing. Kim Warfield, we know him as the Wolf, says, how about those Hoosiers? Let me see what's going on, because I know they beat the brakes off of Bama. Hoosiers got a little revenge for Notre Dame, looks to me like. Got a little Notre Dame revenge. I saw it was 31-3 at the start of the fourth quarter. Let's see what we got. Is 38-3. Yeah. I think if they wanted to, they could have hung a half 100 on them. Thanks for that. Thank you for that. Hey, folks, please like, share, subscribe, retweet, say nice things. That's the best thing you can do for this show, is give your good and valuable word of mouth. You're smart. You know people. Tell them about us. See if they want to get involved with this mess. Although we do have super chats and memberships and gifted memberships. And, of course, the ever-popular PayPal, where you give the most, I get the most. Google don't get nothing. We also have a merchandise store full of a wide range of top-quality name-brand items, sure to add a warmth and charm to any room. A focal point of praise and pleasure. Why am I still showing that? Why don't I show this? And our audio podcast, love you audio podcast people. Our audio podcast is available on Podbean. It's available on Apple Podcasts. It's available on Spotify. So I've been told. And lots of other Podcast Pup, Podcast Clown, Podcast Weasel. Anybody that aggregates probably has our show somewhere. And that would be helpful. Most of all, we want you to have a great 2026. And remember that tomorrow night's show will be on the inexplicable disappearance of a journalist and, well, she did other things. I'll just say that. And tune in tomorrow afternoon. Oh, sorry, Sunday afternoon, 2 days. No, tomorrow. Actually, tomorrow night, to learn about Susan Walsh, the mysterious disappearance of Susan Walsh. And then on Sunday, requested by our good friend and viewer, roller skater Texas girl, we will have the wonderful Soap, the sitcom. We'll tell you all about Soap, the sitcom. And in between those two times, I'll schedule next week's shows. So if you really want one bad, you better say so now. Or forever hold your pieces. Yes. That's all I got. Unless somebody pops something up in the chat. That's all the business I got to do. It is the holidays. I've just kept doing shows. I realize not a lot of people have time to watch them, but my shows, they're only topical in the sense that I do them. This is obviously a story from 1977, and it's what we in the business like to call evergreen. People will, when they're looking up this particular incident, it pops up. So anyway, with all that being said, I think I'm going to just start playing one song at the end of the show. There's no reason to play two because people aren't filing in. So you got your choice. Is that him, Tom Gulley, or Happy to Be Here? You tell me which one and I'm playing it. I got my favorite. I know which one's my favorite. I'm aware of that. This is our last, no, it's our first show, 2026. Yay, how about that? Okay, nobody picked anything, so I myself will pick the ender. Well, I'm looking at that old clock on the wall, like the Reverend Al Green. I guess it's time for me to get on up out of here. You do not have to go home, but you can't stay here. And with all that being said, I think the only thing left to say is, till next time, we'll see you next time. Great. Somebody commented right as I'm leaving. This better be good. Oh, it is. It's Jean Genie. Oh, she wants Happy to Be Here. Jean Genie, for you, anything. I was going to play the other one, by the way. So I'm glad I stopped. I'm glad I switched back to mono from the stereo and stopped. Good to see you, Jean Genie. And here, by request, is Happy to Be Here. We'll see you next time.
Early in the morning, daylight coming through. Coffee on the console, red lights next to blue. Got a voice that settles in, easy, calm and true. The man from Gulley next to you. He's got stories in the static, time in his hands, turning ordinary moments into things you understand. You know I'm happy to be here. Tom is thinking again. Got the Chad leaning closer to hear where he's been. You know I'm happy to be here. Feel the calm he sends when he smiles like that. You know the day begins. Riding waves, late shows rolling on. Voices in the darkness till the break of dawn. The podcast king commands his mic next to him.